firstly, thank you for coming this evening. I know you are taking time out of your personal evenings, whatever you had planned to do today, so I really do appreciate the fact that you've taken time to be here. It is therefore now my job to make sure that you're spending your time wisely. Therefore, our job is to entertain you. So we're here to talk about the trust in the construction industry and how the equation of trust is changing, needs to change, and has changed. What we're hoping to do today is have an open and frank conversation. I don't have a script. There are no slides to go on these screens. The only thing I wish we could have had is a fire here to really embellish that fireside chat. I'll briefly introduce my two lovely panelists, and then we'll jump into a couple of questions, and then I'll open it up to you to ask questions as well, right? And that way we can make this something that you can go home with as though you've picked up something new, picked up something informative, picked up something that provoked your thought into a different way of doing things. So that's my hope for what you get this evening, some entertainment and something to go home with. So to my far left is Amy Morley, who is the Program Controls Director of High-Speed 2 and the entirety of High-Speed 2, which is Phase 1 and Phase 2. Amy has spent 8 years on High-Speed 2, which is a remarkably long period of time to spend on that project. And she told me today that she also worked on the hybrid bill of that project. This is incredibly rare to have someone that has seen a project from its infancy to what it is today, which is full-fledged delivery. And hopefully Amy will see the thing through all the way till the end, to come back here and share all the stories with everyone else. We also have Beth West, who is currently the Chief Executive of East West Rail, a project that connects Cambridge to Oxford. Beth has an illustrious career. She has also spent time on High-Speed 2 in a commercial role. She's worked as the development director at Landsec, as well as the managing director of the Southern and London regions of at Balfour Beatty, a major contractor here in the UK. And I am Dev Amratia. I serve as the chief executive to nPlan, a company I helped found together with Alan Moscow, who's here in the audience. We at nPlan use data to forecast the outcomes of construction projects. And we do that across 8 different countries. We've now processed just over $1.4 trillion worth of capital projects have been through our system. And we exist to help the world forecast. Cool, I'm now going to sit down. And we're going to jump into this. Beth, maybe you can kick us off. Why do you think we're in this position where the client and the contractor generally start from a position of mistrust? They just don't trust each other, and off we go and build without that.
There are many, many reasons on that one. I think from the beginning and the outset, the way in which we procure is a challenge. I'm coming from a commercial background. I have no problem with public procurement rules, but it's the way in which we procure things often, which tends to go towards lowest price without understanding necessarily the qualities that people are going to bring along with that. And if you look at other industries, automotive is a good example that's used, is that the auto industry tends to build their supply chain. So they know their suppliers, they build long relationships with trust, and then they actually collaborate with each other all the way through the design and delivery process. I'm from Detroit originally, and there was in the Detroit History Museum, there's actually a whole thing about how the auto industry changed. And there was a thing on the wall, which I keep shooting myself because I didn't take a photo of it, which talked about how the auto industry was exactly like construction. You had the designers over there doing something that nobody really knew anything about. Then you have the people who are building it sort of in the factory who they never talk to each other and they haven't quite figured it out. And so they've shifted, the entire industry shifted to a place where they bring their suppliers on board with them, and it's everybody is working towards the same objective, and everyone's objectives, and everyone's a winner or everyone's a loser. They're one or the other. And the construction industry has managed to build itself up in a way that there are winners and losers. So if somebody wins, somebody has to lose. It tends to be the culture. And I think the worst examples are on that are when you've got somebody buying a job. So you've got somebody who's bidding so low to win that job, whether or not they can deliver it. Sometimes it's really a legitimate reason why they've got a low price, but sometimes people are lowballing it in the hope that they will get their returns back through variations. I see nodding. And this is, for me, as a client, it's like the worst position you could possibly be in, because you know the game that they're playing, and you just see all the really horrible behaviors, and then you just get into fights and conflict, and nobody trusts each other because you see that game being played.
Is there a time that game is okay to play?
I think there are reasons people will put a low bid in. Sometimes it will be because they actually have a better way. They've come up with an innovative way to deliver something. Great. Sometimes people will put in a loss leader, and they will bid lower for a reason. My own view, though, is that kind of trying to game the system, it might work in the short term, but it usually ends in tears one way or the other, and just that space where you don't want to work with a company again. And for me, success is you want to go back and you want to work with somebody again, because you've actually both had a good outcome. And that, to me, is the biggest success, is that everyone, contractors have made a good profit, the clients got what they want at a lower cost than they thought they were going to get it for. That's success. And too often we just see one or both sides deeply unhappy.
I do want to build a little bit more on that. Amy, the trust, the lack of trust, also spans within organizations, right? Like, it's not just between client and contractor. Sometimes even just teams within one organization don't trust each other. And then that has all sorts of negative effects that we start to see, right? Talk to me a little bit about why you see that happening.
Yeah, and I guess it depends on the context in which we're talking about trust. So from my perspective, it's going to be talking about performance data, or where do we see the outcomes or forecasting outcomes of a program. And when you talk about the difference between client and contractor, you're clearly trying to align kind of two perhaps different outcomes that you want to achieve. If you then put that inside an organisation, you then have to try and create a culture within the organisation that you can escalate up or have difficult conversations within an organisation before you can start having those conversations with perhaps your client or perhaps even with your contractor. And I think that is quite a difficult culture to have a conversation with internally, particularly when, and we were talking about this the other day, around when you're dealing with ambiguity. So often in controls, you are looking at data, but it will materialize quite early. And so perhaps you might have an early warning that something might be happening, but have you got a culture internally where you can raise that early warning safely and it be received in the way in which you've understood it to occur? So we've not worked it through completely, but we think there might be X or Y occurring. And how the other party, or how within the organisation up through the people that you work with, respond when you raise those issues is critical to then how that then plays down into the team, because when they come to you next time, will they be as open and transparent? Will they be as clear about what they're seeing or how those things are materialising? And only if you get to a point of culture where you can be transparent and raise early warnings in a safe space where you can leave it ambiguous and still have time to go away and work it, but have that transparency, can you really then start to get a view of what you think the overall outcome would be and start to get accuracy around the forecast, I think.
Yeah. Talk to us a little bit about some of the practices, tools, techniques, the things that you've done, right, within your organization, not a simple, small, or easy organization to implement any of these things with. Talk to us a little bit about what you've done in this space that helps here.
Yeah, and I mean, we're not perfect by any means, but certainly for us within program controls, we have driven to data heavily. So all about single source of truth. So there's one way in which data is received from the contractors or internally only. It all goes into one system. Everyone has access to the same data platform and the same Power BI, MI automatically at the same point every month. So whether it's the contractors or us as the client at all levels, the same people open exactly the same information in the same Power BI dashboards and are looking at the same data, and you drive everything through data and fact rather than people intervening at particular points in the month and saying, well, I'll just overlay that, or I'll add a little bit of optimism bias in because I'll probably be able to get it back next month. We've removed as much as possible the ability to be able to do that because it's literally pure data that then spits out and gives you an outcome or a forecast in terms of where we are. But it's not just us within Controls. I think the organisation has built a relationship with our stakeholders or otherwise where we've tried to found that on transparency, so to be as transparent as possible, even if the message isn't one that you necessarily want to hear. The earlier you can start having those conversations, then the more chance you have of being able to work together to intervene and find a solution. And I think that's been championed by our leadership team throughout the organisation and with colleagues in government about how we want to work together.
Beth, let's look at you started by answering the question about this one of the large causes of the mistrust is centered around how you procure construction, right? There could be other reasons that it's generated, but let's talk about procurement for a quick second here. Tell us a little bit more about what you've seen and done that tries to come closer towards the place where the client and the contractor can trust each other. And talk to us a little bit about what you see as a good example there.
I think a lot comes down to, again, is sort of when do you procure as well, and what's the timing of when you're going to be bringing in partners. And I think that there are good practices where you have two-stage contracts where you bring in and you work on the design first, and then you agree on what the price is going to be. But then you have to kind of accept that when you go for that kind of an approach, that you might not like the price you're going to get. And then what do you do with that? You hopefully will have somebody who is whoever you're working with is going to be, again, transparent in the way that they're putting their costs together and what they're going to be doing about that. The other question though is how do you think about things and kind of unpack the way in which you're going to procure? And I think most of things come down to design and also bringing it. Your design drives your costs. It's not you can squeeze unit costs all you want, but at the end of the day, it's the how many units are you moving of whatever that's going to be driving your costs and driving your program ultimately, and that comes back to how you're going to design stuff. So the more you can bring your partners in earlier in that procurement process and the people who are actually going to be delivering that into your design process, I think that's where you're going to get into a space where you're having the trade-off conversations early of, if you want to do that thing, this is what the cost is going to be. So I think that there are lots of ways that you can use the same tools, but think about bringing them in a different order or in a different or assess in a different way to get to the more of a partnering approach. A lot of the Project 13 behaviors that we've all talked about are good examples, and trying to think about as well, how do you get companies in as partners rather than just being tactical about your procurement, and how can you look at things in a little bit longer perspective?
Yeah, you said something earlier that hope they'll be transparent about it. I have to call you out on those words because hope is great. I have lots of hope that we will have a fantastic economy to look forward to. But that's not going to be enough, I think. How do you make it transparent? How do you? And it's not that we hope that one day we'll actually see what these outcomes are going to be. We want to know them.
This is the critical point about the data, and Amy's absolutely right. The more you can put things into a factual-based perspective, that you will be much more likely to be able to have a conversation about fact rather than emotion or what you think might happen. The problem is that you can't assess whether or not someone's going to tell you the truth through a bidding process. People have done behavioral assessments. I've seen that happen where you do the behavioral assessment and lo and behold, people's behaviors aren't as good as you thought they were going to be because they've been trained on doing a behavioral assessment process. And so, you can kind of game, again, it goes back to, are you gaming the system in the beginning and when you're going to start out with? I think when you get back into having that factual data on the platform on which we can have a conversation and understand, I think the other thing is, when you mobilize and when you set things up from the outset, what's the culture you're bringing in? And how do you, back to Amy's point about how are people going to react when you've got a problem? You've got to be in a culture where it's not, and I was called on this something this morning, which is a lot of our vocabulary is about battle. You know, we talk about things. I was called out about calling something a war room. It's like, could we please change that please change that word, because that connotes something really bad happening. Let's have the war room. And I said, well, that was 30 years of me being programmed to be the tough guy, right? And that's not really helpful, because if you think you're going into battle all the time, you're not in the how can we solve a problem in a collective and collaborative way. And that's where you have to set your behaviors in the outset to think about, okay, well, what are we going to do to actually get to the outcomes that we want? And you have to keep coming back to it. And it's not something that, those cultural things are not common in the industry. And you have to keep coming back and testing them and kind of reminding everybody that this is what you're trying to achieve, and that and when new people are coming onto a project, how do you get them into the right space to think about how you're going to work together?
Yeah. Linking to that, Amy, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this culture piece, right? You talked about transparency and making sure basically that the people at the top don't beat the people at the bottom for giving them information. But talk to me a little bit about what you see in there that really allows that to flourish.
Yeah, interesting. And I mean, I think if I can, I might just pick up a little bit on the client contractor thing first, and then think about our organisation. But I think that for me there are kind of three main ingredients in terms of what you put in place in terms of building that trust between you and the contractor. And one is, first of all, understanding, is the other party acting in our best interest, and vice versa? And then are they capable to then do what it is that you need to do, and are they going to be reliable? And I think lots of people often rely on the capability and the reliability bit without necessarily understanding that, are we acting in the best interest piece? And actually one of the things we've been trying to do, and again, not perfectly, but how can you align our mission and what it is that we want to achieve with what the contractor ultimately wants to achieve in their mission? And of course, from the outset, you kind of think, well, you're all building a railway, so that's obvious. But of course, it's not obvious, because the contractor has completely different outcomes that mean success for them in addition to achieving the railway than we do as a client. And the closer you kind of come together to understand how are you acting in each other's best interests, not just the contractor in the best interest of the client, then the greater then you can build that kind of trust and transparency. And only then, in a program like ours, once you've built that trust and transparency with the contractor, can you start having open and transparent conversations then internally and bring it into the program, because you've got to have that foundation to know that when you are going forward to say, do you know what, actually I think there might be a cost or a schedule issue, is that founded in something that's solid because you've got trust and faith in what it is that the contractor's told you or that you've understood in terms of the performance on the ground, rather than just our view of what we've had to overlay to then be able to take that view. So I think that's kind of a fundamental foundation point for me. And then I think there's no magic ingredient, right, for how a culture, it's down to people in the organisation and their ambition or otherwise as to how they want to operate. And so it's completely down to the leadership team as a collective, all the way from the top down, and then how that kind of emulates across the organisation. And I could sit here and talk about our values and all sorts of things that everybody would talk about and kind of have their view, but it's more than that, and it's every interaction that you have and reinforced through every conversation that I have with my team, and then my leadership team have with their team, about having that safe space to be able to come forward and talk about any issue, however it might materialise. And you might then have a conversation around handling or what you might do with it, but let's have the conversation to start with, so that we can then work out how we're going to, or what we're going to do about it, if we need to do anything or intervene. And again, I said earlier, but you can't really argue with fact and data. So as soon as you root everything in fact and data, it's very difficult. So even if you're having a very difficult conversation, and even if it perhaps isn't received in the way in which we'd all like, in a collaborative way that's going to be problem solving, the data's the data. So as long as you're brave enough to go and have the conversation initially, you can't argue with it. So the more we try and get everything based in data, and obviously we're doing some stuff with you, Dev, on nPlan, and trying to look at how we might be forecasting and routing stuff in data, how you then handle it is kind of up to the individuals, but the facts remain the facts. And then we have to get into problem solving mode rather than arguing about how the problems happened in the first place.
Yeah, it'll be no secret that I'm a huge proponent of using data, but but there's also a difficult side to this, right? We've just said data. There's no way you can argue with the data, but projects inherently contain uncertainty, and the earlier you are in your project, the more uncertain you are about the outcome. Yet, data and its association with data very often creates the notion that that it is an acceptable question to ask for the specific outcome that may occur in an uncertain world, right? Something that actually has a tremendous amount of conflict, and generally you cannot answer such questions. How do we, in a sense now, use data to solve the ambiguity or the amount of uncertainty that exists in this? And if I can just cite one particular example I saw that went out into the public, right, which was Crossrail, and obviously it's all delivered now, so we all know what happened in the end. But if people can remember and cast their minds backwards to around Q1 of 2019, and Crossrail were beginning to announce to the public that they're going to be late, right? Prior to that, there was not much news about that, even though most people thought about it. When they made those announcements, they did something that was quite good. In the BBC, there was a probabilistic range upon which Crossrail is expected to be delivered. It didn't say we're going to start, the previous estimates were in time for the Queen, right? I don't know what the exact, but they had previously put a date down, and then they moved towards a range. And the fact that the BBC reported it as the range was also very, very encouraging. But talk to me, Beth, Amy, talk to me a little bit about how you use data to reduce the amount of uncertainty or handle the ambiguity, either one. Let's start with you, Beth, sorry.
I mean, I think it's really interesting, and sitting at the beginning of a project, you are reliant on a lot of benchmarking data that is not necessarily going to be a direct match. I mean, I was looking at some data which on a project that I worked on at Belfort Beatty, and I knew that the way in which it was procured was really expensive because even though we were the evil contractor kind of thing, we kept saying to the client, this is not a good way to procure this. This is going to cost you more money. And they just said, well, we have to do it this way. There's nothing we can do about it. We have to do it this way. So that was showing up as one of our benchmarks. And it was like, well, this was procured really badly. It can't be it can't be the benchmark. So I think there's a way in which you can look at the you've got to make sure you've got the right benchmarking. I think there are other things that you can do about. We used to call something a bunker model at Landsec, where we'd look at sort of for buildings. We get an estimate, and then we say, well, what's the plain vanilla estimate without any? If these constraints weren't here, what would be the estimate? So we'd be looking at specifically what are the things that were driving costs above your standard benchmarks, and how do you get those numbers down? But I think that I think on the one hand, we need to recognize that at an early stage in a project, you don't have all the information to even make a good a good judgment on what the costs are going to be, because you're going on that benchmarking data. So you do need to take what is the best thing you can come up with for the benchmarks, and then you've got to find a way and not use spurious science, as I call it, because I think that sometimes things look like you've got all this data, and obviously your number's going to be absolutely perfect, but you haven't done your ground investigations, or you haven't done, you haven't actually put your detail together. So it looks really, really certain, but it's actually it's not, because it's not based on detailed design, or it's not based on something that you can actually sort of cotton onto. So I think it's a challenge, but I think it's reflecting and having that honest discussion about this is a very early stage and these are the things that are going to happen. So I think ranges are really important in that regard, and sort of what is the range, and then how do you get to greater degrees of certainty, and having the conversation about, when you're talking about a highway or a railway, at the first instance, someone's drawn a line on a page, right? It's just a line on a page, and then you've got a big swathe of land either side of it where you're trying to figure out where's the best place to put that line. But until you've done all your investigations, you're not going to get to something that's a lot more certain. So I think it's knowing those degrees of uncertainty as you're going through, and where are the points going to be when you can actually have that greater degree of certainty.
Yeah.
I completely agree. That point is super important. So at the beginning, I mean, Crossrail, I think moving to a range has been significant for a number of different programs and given the ability to be able to give confidence around a range publicly. And even if you want to set targets and incentives internally around milestones, at least then publicly or wider, then you can manage within that range. But I think getting stakeholders comfortable at a point with that level of uncertainty, you can only really do if you've got that path to this is when the key points will happen, where we'll have greater certainty and when we can start to get greater certainty around where we might sit within that range. And I think you should be able to map out that path with even at a very high level to start with around procurement timetables or design maturity or when you get to particular milestones in the program.
Yeah.
And then that itself matures over time once you understand how your risk profile or otherwise is materializing. I think the other thing that we did was we triangulated different forecast data. So instead of just looking at one way, perhaps through a QRA or through RCF or through other different estimating tools that you might use to give a forecast, use 3 or 4 to bring together that total picture. So there is a balance because you don't want to use every tool under the sun to try and give a certainty that doesn't exist. But at least if you've got something where you can see the differences between that different data and that triangulation, or hopefully you would have some commonality between them, then at least it gives some confidence around that forecast or some confidence around at least where you're holding risk against that forecast and when you might then be able to get greater certainty, I think.
Yeah. There's a client we work with in Canada that's building a large $40 billion petrochemical facility, which is large. And they're in mid-flight. And he said something to the nPlan team, which really resonated, which is the role of his role and his team's role is to continually understand whether they are mitigating risk at the appropriate rate at the appropriate rate. And I found that illuminating because he didn't say, I'm here to deliver the project on time. He could have said that. It'd be really not a bad thing to say, and nothing would have been weird about that if he did say that. But he chose very specifically to say that his primary objective is to ensure that we are reducing risk at the appropriate rate. That doesn't mean suddenly, kapoof, all the risk has gone away. There's going to be risk all the way till the very final day before you push the big green button, and just understanding whether it's moving at the right rate. So Amy, you just said earlier, making sure that as you progress the project, you have a way of checking that you are indeed improving and reducing uncertainty, improving certainty. The further to that, right, would be to say, as you are continually developing the project, that is the rate at which you are doing that appropriate? Where you're not reducing that uncertainty profile at the appropriate rate, you turn up the heat, right? That's how you know you are not doing well or a good proactive indicator of it. Well, if you're the other way around, then pat yourself on the back a little bit. But the topic that we're touching on here is largely about outcomes, right? We're talking about an uncertain outcome about a probabilistic future. Now, these are all big words that are really hard to enshrine into procurement. And back to when I started, right? I asked Beth, why are we in this problem where the client and the contractor don't trust each other? And the first thing you said, without my prompt, was procurement. And so if we try and draw a little virtual circle here, we've started there and we've come back to that we are trying to procure outcomes, yet it's very difficult to procure an outcome. Very. Government, if we can point our finger there, government procurement is generally incentivized on the lowest cost. I know there are pockets of excellence that exist, but in general terms, the lowest cost is by far the biggest weight and therefore the biggest contributor to the win. But we know that the outcome is what you should procure for, right? And incentivize towards that. How do we move that needle?
I think there's something that comes back to the internal side before you get to the procurement side, which is about how you make sure you've got the focus right. And we've been talking a lot recently about working on, spending all of our time working on the answer, not the product. So we're spending time. I want to spend all of our time on doing the analysis to get to the right answer rather than what's the presentation we're going to give. And I think we get it wrong a lot of the times. And so we spend, I think we spend a lot of time, is our report right? Rather than is the information that we're actually using to make decisions accurate enough to make a decision. So it's making sure the focus is right. That rather than it being about is this the right format on this page, which I think a lot of people spend a lot of time on, is do I have information that I can use to make a decision? And how do I make, if I don't, how do I get the information that I need to make a decision? Mm-hmm. And from there, I think it goes into some of the procurement processes, which is, because I was a banker, I kind of focus on risk because I was on the debt side and there was no upside as a banker on the debt side. You only lost money if it didn't go right. There was no, and if it goes well, you'll get a huge equity return. So I'm always thinking about, am I kind of, are the risks going to materialize? How do we stop the risks from materializing? And I think that it's about that. It's absolutely on that risk mitigation side of things because they do happen. But how do we then focus what we're doing to mitigate the risks rather than doing the thing that always drives me crazy is I'm going to do what we did last time and then do a risk register and then get finance to give me some money. It's looking at your procurement activity is can I mitigate my risk through the way in which I'm procuring? So what is going to be the biggest risk on this project? Who has the best way to mitigate that risk of everyone that we're seeing? It might not end up in the lowest cost, but if that's the best way to mitigate that risk because they've got a really cool solution to do whatever it may be, that's who you should use. Because if that's your biggest problem, find the person who is going to be able to be the best person to solve that problem, not the person who's sort of doing the standard thing. And I think that's how you work your way through and have those honest conversations about how do you get to those good outcomes.
Yeah.
And I think if you think about risk as one of the main levers that you have to try and influence the outcome either in cost or time. So as you go through a program and then you go through a maturity of procuring over time, your ability to influence spend reduces because the more spend that you've got firm procured, then your ability to leverage or change where the overall outcome cost is going to be then starts to fall completely in risk, be it time or cost. And if you're not laser focused on what you're doing and mitigating there, then you're just accepting the P50 or P80 outcome that you did in the model at the beginning. And you could say at the beginning what the outturn cost was going to be, but I think that's a big lever that you have to then, if you get after that, and think about where you might be able to spend to save or where you might be able to mitigate most effectively, then you start to get a better sense of where you might outturn in the end.
Yeah. Partners, we also talked earlier about partnering, right? So don't just think of it as a supply chain and a contractor, but think of it as partnering. In partnering, you must obviously ensure that the relationship is fair and equitable, right? Now, how can you make it a fair and equitable relationship when neither party actually understands what risks they're about to undertake, right? Neither party can come to the table in a call it a grown-up way and have the adult conversation, difficult conversation, because it's not always palatable, about what risks actually exist, right? And we've talked about the use of data here. We've got tons of cool examples from nPlan about how people have done this. My question is more about how do you enshrine this? It's great that we have pockets of examples that exist, right? And Nick is here from the IPA, and that we have the construction playbook, which is another fantastic initiative to help us move the thing forward. And I know this question is bigger than a single answer will ever be able to create the silver bullet for. But do you have ideas here inside public procurement? Let's stick to public procurement for a second. That enshrine the behavior of partnering and partnering for the probable outcome. The wilder, the better.
There's no silver bullet, though, is there? I mean, Ruth will come at this. Beth will come at this from a point of experience in commercial and procurement. There is no silver bullet, and there's multiple ingredients to it. I think one of the things that, picking up on what Beth said was at the beginning, which was trying to work out that when you're going through a strategic partnership, sometimes what appears to be the lowest cost isn't actually the lowest cost option. And so working with stakeholders to help them understand that through contract variation or change or the life of the program, actually what we're looking at in terms of something that might be more quality based or something where you're building that partnership up front still could end up being the lowest cost option in the end, for a variety of reasons, and bringing your experience and kind of other bits and pieces into it to try and get stakeholders to understand why that might be the case. But Beth, you've probably got better sense in commercial.
I think there's a little bit about holding your nerve, and that, you know, if you decide to go forth on a path, you need to make sure that that path is, you know, end to end works together. So you can do a procurement activity, but if the rest of your delivery side of the business doesn't actually buy into the procurement approach, then that's not going to work. So you need to have the whole thing set up so that your entire organization is buying into your philosophy of what you're going to do, and then you have to hold your nerve. And if when things start to go a little bit wrong, which they inevitably do, you have to kind of work the way the way you designed it to work, and have faith in the fact that you set it up. You know, there are loads and different ways that you can set up a project, and they all can work. There's not a single way that will create nirvana. But I think it's about looking at those risks at the outset, trying to find the way in which you bring the people who into the program who can help solve those risks, and then sticking with it. Because what I've seen, and Amy, you'll have seen this before as well, is that, things go a little bit wrong, so we have to go back to the traditional way of doing things. And it's the thing I've found about frustrating about the contracting market is that if you don't get 100% of the benefits you were trying to achieve, it's been deemed as failure, as opposed to a step to the to getting better. And that goes, people do it time and time again, and they go, we didn't get 100%, so we're going to go back to the old-fashioned way. And that therein lies, no progress whatsoever. So it's sort of also accepting that if you're trying to get 100%, but you get 50 or 75, that's better than getting nothing. So you've got to keep going and keep making the progress, and that's why this, lots of programs get set up in order to get that kind of productivity gain as you go through.
Yeah. This will be my last one.
I feel like we need to argue about something, though. So could you make it really contentious?
You want to have an
argument?
Yeah,
we need to disagree about something. So could you make it really, spiky?
I'll try it. I have one that potentially is quite spiky on how you deal with it. It links back again to the data point. So at nPlan, we can tell our clients the probable outcome of the project. And no matter how much our client pays us, shouts at us, loves us, any of those things, the result is always the same, right? That isn't always the same when you, say, hire a consultant to do the same thing. You could twist their arm a little bit, and then you get a different result that you like. But unfortunately, that doesn't work at nPlan. That we therefore we have a few frenemies. We think we're doing it for the right reasons, or so far we hope it's for the right reasons. But more seriously, the reason this becomes challenging is the short-termist threat that an individual receives when they are dealing with information that wouldn't suit them or wouldn't suit their organization, right? Resistance is a fairly natural human emotion to go through, and even more is the fact that when we hire people in this industry, we hire a project manager to take ownership of the project, and ownership means that you have an opinion, right? You have an opinion about what needs to be done to do something, and all of a sudden data from a machine is telling you something else. How would you overcome that? What advice would you give out there, right? To say, we as a project management profession, and I know, Amy, you sit on the board of the APM, right? As a profession, how do we overcome the fact that data and machines and systems are going to and are exceed our mental capacity in computing many aspects of project delivery? And at the moment, nPlan does one trick, and I'm sure there are going to be other providers in the industry that do other tricks at some point, right? And probably are other tricks already in there. But humans seem to be somewhat of the weak link here. And I don't mean, that sounds very wrong, but What would you do to help us overcome this? We'll start with Amy.
Well, it's a big question, Dev. It's a big
Finale.
question. It is a finale. No, I mean, I think it's the same. It's same as some of the things that we've already said. I mean, I think I would argue whether, and perhaps this is part of the point of the question, but I would argue whether those machines and the AI will ever completely take over in terms of taking a view, because I think there will always be elements of needing to have an expert with experience that has some judgment over the top. But I think the trick is understanding where the limitations are of the data and where you want to take a judgment, and then being transparent about where you've taken those judgments and why that might differ then from what the model is telling you. So I think there's a balance there between, will we ever get to a point where you just plug a load of stuff into nPlan software and out then spits the answer and everybody accepts that as data and given, and that's the answer. I think that will take some time before we get to that point. So I think there'll always be an element of judgment. I think though some of these tools are still quite early in their inception in terms of major programs, so one of the things will be about more use of them, and the more that people become familiar with them, and the more that people understand the outputs, and the more that people understand the value that they can bring to the program, then the more comfortable people are going to become with becoming more reliant on them and understanding where that then adds value into the program.
I think we need to think about how we reward and recognize our people, because we've got an industry where the hero rides out on the white stallion, right? Yeah. And we love that. We love to reward people for solving the really crappy problem that they've been left with, and we never reward the person who is slowly either stop a project from happening. People don't get rewarded from stopping a bad project from happening. So how do we used to say this when I was in banking again. The credit officers are the people who they could win no matter what they did. So they either stop something, a bad loan from happening, or if good things are, if good loans are happening, they're just in the background. So who are the people who are like that, who are stopping the bad projects from happening? Why aren't we rewarding them? Because we don't. We reward people who are, those heroes on the stallions, and we're not thinking about, and so people gravitate towards, I need to be putting this project forward, and then and then that's where you get the ropey data, and that people are kind of making some stuff up to get things approved. But rather than saying, actually, it's a really good thing to not do that project or to not do that thing, because it's not going to be for the benefit of our organization, but we don't do that yet. And I think it's also when people get stuff wrong, the best people just need a cuddle. They don't need to be shouted at, because the best people are no one's going to make them feel worse than they feel themselves, right? So we need to give them a cuddle and say, that's okay, we still love you, let's fix this problem. And so I think that there's this whole thing about the way we treat our people, the way we're rewarding things, how we reward them for identifying problems, stopping bad things from happening before they even, sort of get on their way. And then we can use the data in an effective way to solve those problems. But we just need to be a bit more, I think, thinking ourselves about what does good look like.
Yeah.
And good sometimes might just be not doing something.
Yeah. Will told me earlier that he likes analogies. I have one for you, Will. I think projects are like poker, not like chess. Chess is a game where it is entirely computationally known, every single move, depending on every other move that is played on that board. And projects are not like that. They're like poker, where you play a game of bets. And as more information arrives, your bets continue to evolve. The amount of uncertainty you hold continues to change. But ultimately, it is a game where you're taking decisions and you have a bit of luck as well, right? But decisions and result, so the worst thing a poker player can ever do is attribute their success to their result, i.e., I win a big hand, therefore I'm a good poker player. No. I deliver a project on time, therefore I am a good project manager. No. Possible. Not saying it's not possible. But it is the decisions you take along the journey that makes you the strong poker player / project manager / project professional, right? And rewarding that decision power, the decision quality, right, as you make the project go along its journey is remarkably powerful.
Yeah. But data's a bad poker face. right? I mean, data is a bad poker face. So the thing with playing poker is you don't know what the other person's got. And if you've got a good poker face, then, or your contractor's running 3 sets of books, you don't know, so you don't know what you've got. Whereas when you have data, it's somebody with a really bad poker face, and therefore you're much more able to respond accordingly. And so maybe your responses to the data that you've got in front of you are demonstrating that you are a good project manager because you are responding in the appropriate way to what you've got in front of you.
Let's leave the analogy at the data is probably the league table of poker players, and so you know who you're up against. With that, would love to open it up to the audience if you have any questions. There's Balint, yes.
Well, first of all, excellent. So, hi there. First of all, thanks for the conversation. Really enjoyed. And I almost fall in the trap of thinking about a question at the beginning and forget to listen. But I have a question. And so
write it down next time. Write it down and then you can listen.
As a consultant, I'm often in the position when I'm the common enemy for a client and a contractor as well. So I bring them together. But there were a couple of conversations where I found there was a really good synergy and partnership. And when there was a problem, the client and the contractor was solemnly thinking about how to solve. And there was no conversation about who owns that problem, who will pay for it at the end. And there was another conversation that was entirely based on the contract. And it seemed the contractor knew it better than the client. And everything was between these constraints and rules. So my question is, what do you think, what is more important, the soft skills and the kind of partnership depends more on people and let's say the project controls and data, or how well the rules set at the beginning and how well every parties understand these rules, aka the contract?
I mean, it's a no-brainer for me. I think it's the soft skills, and obviously you have to have the foundation of how you've set the contract. But back to my bit at the beginning, if you talk about the kind of 3 ingredients for me of how you build the trust, one is, are you acting in each other's best interest? Have you got the capability and are you reliable? If you just focus on have you got the capability and are you delivering it on time, which is the rules of the contract, and not the manner in which you're executing that contract and thinking about outcomes and acting in each other's best interest, then you still don't build that relationship of trust and ultimately perhaps might not get to the right outcome in terms of something that works for both parties that's met both of their interests. So I think for me personally, it's the soft skills and the ability to be able to get the right people in the room, have the right conversation, sort the contract stuff afterwards about who's going to pay it, because that will come. But if you can resolve the problem in the room together, that's got to be the outcome that becomes best for the program overall.
So I have a slight disagreement, and I'm going to give you my politician's answer, which is both are important and they have to work together. No, but they have to work together because you can't have. And I've seen this. I've seen this in a lot of different places. If your contract is completely disassociated with what the rest of things are going on, it probably doesn't work either. So your contract has to reflect how your soft skills are going to be set up. And if they don't, you're probably going to get into some sort of mess one way or t'other, because it's sort of, if you're doing all this stuff over here and then all of a sudden you have a problem and then your lawyers get dragged in and it will be a giant mess. So it all has to hang together so that you have to get your contract to be reflecting how you want the whole thing to be set up. And if you don't have that connection, I think you do get into problems. That's when you are hoping. Yeah, you're kind of going, well, it's not. Hopefully, nothing will happen because we don't want to go to the contract. That's a bad place too. So you need them to be absolutely joined up.
Yeah. Simon.
Yes, I'm going to ask you to pick something. You're both working on very complex things, right? And you have things in your sphere of influence you can deal with and things that you can't deal with. Where do you feel the cultural bottleneck, right? So if you take the Department for Transport, we'll call it government, you guys, client organizations, right, and the contracting supply chain. Where do you feel, if you had to go, well, one of those 3 has to be more adaptable to deal with the fact that everything's going to change and it's all going to be pretty mad. Which one of those 3 is the first one you should invest time in order to make sure that you can deal with the change?
Man, Simon.
Nick just left the room, so perhaps we can answer. But, yeah, and I think Nick would agree. I think from our perspective, and there's stuff in all three, right? And you'll know that as well, Simon. But for me, I think the more time that we're investing with our government stakeholders and the way in which they understand the world in which we're operating between us and our contractors, then the easier it becomes effectively to be able to have the difficult conversations we've talked about in terms of program performance. And I think we've come some way in that, but I think there's more to do in terms of having those conversations more generally with government side. So that would be my choice.
Yeah.
Same.
What she said.
Yeah.
Slam dunk, start from the
Thank you.
top.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There we go, Martin.
Thanks, Dev. Great conversation so far.
Is it going to go horribly wrong?
What are you going to ask, Martin?
It's a two-part question for me. The first one is for Beth, and I did write it down, Beth, so I'll listen to your advice in advance. The first part is about the risk management thing that Dev's been talking about. Yeah. So Dev's saying, from this Canadian experience, it's all about managing the risk, all right? Do we need to change that narrative? So this spiky question you've been talking about, do we need to change that narrative? Is it's not about risk, it's about variance. If we start to think about variance, we start to move into change management, logistics, sort of foreign exchange rates, etc., which through a data lens is just clustering. So if we can start to think about this in a different way, we start to change the way we deliver projects because we start to blow up some of the fundamental thinking. So what's your view on that question? And then I've got a question for Amy in a minute.
I feel like that question's too hard. No, I guess I probably sit at more of a macro level than that, which in terms of how I think about it, which isn't to say that it doesn't need to be carrying on all the way through organizations, but I kind of go really macro on risk because it's sort of what are your strategic objectives you're trying to achieve? What are the strategic risks that are going to stop you from getting there? And tend to kind of, I personally focus on those and then try to arrange myself to make sure the objectives are being hit and that the risks are being mitigated. I think when you get into stuff, when you get into the variances in the data, there's a bit of a, and again, this is these are live conversations that we're having at the moment in East West Rail Company, which is about thinking about those strategic risks, going out and doing taking a direction, going out and doing a bit of work, coming back again and iterating on what you've learned, and that should be bringing your variances in, I think, as well. But it's sort of it's trying to think about things in a much more agile way to be able to deal with those rather than going, this is what we're doing and we're not changing. You sort of have to think about how you're going to deal with those things as you're going along and tack and make those changes. And that's where you get your good project managers, because you're adapting to those situations and seeing what's going on. So I probably didn't answer your question very well, but...
it's great, thank you.
It's a continuum for me as well. So you can't just focus on risk, but the risk then materializes into those variances and into those changes, and it's a continuum across from sort of left to right about how they occur. So I don't think it's right to be focused on one or the other, but if you think, in my head anyway, if you think about risk as the source of then said variances, if you're focusing predominantly on trying to mitigate as much risk as you can, then you're effectively trying to reduce then the amount of variance and change. At the point at which you've got something into a trend that's then on its way to its variance, you can influence it a bit in terms of trying to get a better outcome at the end, but the more that you mitigate before it's even occurred, for me, I think is where I'd put a lot of effort.
Yeah. There's a better answer.
Thank you. And a quick question for Amy as well is about the skills in the industry. All right, so do you see that we've got the skills so we can start to drive this data agenda? So if we are starting to transition to dev sort of approach, nPlan's the data-driven sort of project delivery approach, have we got that skill in place? And does that mean we've got the data pipelines in place where you can start to trust the data end to end?
And you know the answer to this, Martin. That's a leading question. But yes and no. We have lots of great people, and we engage with lots of great people, as do the industry, who are either experts in this field or are quickly becoming experts in this field because they see the way in which the market is going. But everybody in this room that's working in project controls or recruiting people in project controls will be having exactly the same issues as me in finding people with the right skills that can fill think my mic's gone off. That we can fill the team. And so I think, there's lots of great work going on. I have lots of apprentices and graduates in my team where we're trying to grow and build that resource pool, where we're trying to then bring people in with different perspectives that can perhaps look at data in a different way or have brought in different experience. But no is the short answer, Martin. There's more work that we need to do collectively with you and with others and across industry to then make sure that we've got those people in place.
That mic thing has nothing to do with what Amy was saying. Yeah, Hez.
Cheers. Hi, everybody. Hi, Beth.
Hi.
Hi, Dev. Hi, Amy. Firstly, I think we should procure capabilities, not outcomes. We can't predict outcomes. I'm going to ask a simple question. Which one of you, and I know, Beth, you've worked on it as well, but which one of you is going to build the better railway for us all?
Oh. Well, they're very different.
Obviously us.
Last question of the evening. Sorry, Will. Yeah.
So we talked about this. We talked about risk mitigation. We talked about lowest cost, which I believe we should be talking about value rather than costs. Actually, minimal viable products and all that stuff, I think, is the wrong language. We should be talking about value. And drive value, because sometimes that adds costs, but long term, drive value. Anyway, with that being the driver for our projects, how do we, and it's maybe a leading question because I'm wrong, but how do we instigate better innovation, driving change, bringing the right mindset to actually allow us to play with people like nPlan, specifically how do we actually gather the opportunities to explore the SMEs, explore the people who will be challenging up, the apprentices that Amy was talking about? How do we bring those people on board and actually let us make those changes, fail safely, but actually create the value as a result of that failure?
Have I not told you about the hackathon you're setting up? Yeah. No, I think it's looking at all kinds of different ways to bring in that innovation, and I think you don't necessarily want to do it on a really complicated structure necessarily, but you might. And it's sort of when do you bring in that resource? I think as well, all kinds of ways. I mean, I think it's changing contracting models. I think a lot of the consultant space, we need to be not paying on bums on seats, but what are the products that you're delivering? So how do we think about a different way of engaging, and when do you do it? They're weird. You could do weird and wacky things like I think we've talked about. I think it's rainbow contracting, where you get a lot of people into a different pot of things. I think it's what are you trying to bring in, and then what's the route to bring it in, and where are you trying to innovate? You don't want to innovate on everything necessarily, but where are the elements you want to do it, and then how do you find that talent, and what do you have to do to engage? Who do you talk to? There's a lot of stuff out there that we in the construction industry don't necessarily know exists. So how do we tap into it? What's the dating service that we need to have that people can connect with other parts of different industries that we connect with? I met Dev because I asked somebody to set up a construction tech workshop, and there were probably 6 other people in the room. No one else I've talked to, but I've known Dev since that time, and it's sort of how do we have more conversations like that? So not every one of those conversations. Not every one of those companies probably survived. Not every one of those conversations is relevant to what I'm doing, but having a conversation with Dev and is totally relevant to what I'm doing. So how do you use a company like nPlan to find that innovation and find a different way? So I think it's opening the door to find them, and what's the right way, right? All kinds of different ways to do that.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that you can make quite a strong value for money argument and still do something and then learn from the outcome, even if you haven't necessarily achieved what you might have envisaged to achieve in the end. You would have still have driven value somewhere, or driven experience, or driven some lessons learned. And I think building a value for money case that then sets out, well, I could spend X or Y and I've got the possibility of achieving all of this saving, but actually being brave enough to say, well, even if we only achieve 5% of that or 10% of that, it's still worth doing, and we're just going to go for it and see, because the possibility of what it might bring to the program is so much larger. And being brave enough to do that, I think, is really key.
Yeah. With that, thank you, Beth. I know your boys have just started school again, so thank you for being here. Amy as well, thank you so much for being here.